Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel, and welcome if you are new here. My name is Andrea M and this is Real Crime Down Under. On the 16th of January 1974, two sisters would cross the street directly in front of their home in Highgate Hill, Brisbane, Queensland to attend their friend's birthday party. At 10:30 p.m. they would return home to find their mother had company. They would go inside the house to find out who was calling and to go to bed. This was the last time Vicky, 13, Leanne, 11, and their mother, Barbara McCulkin, aged 34, would ever be seen alive again. But before we step into today's case, and it's a big one, so get comfy, I would like to remind you all to kidnap the like button, bash the subscribe button, and chain letter link the share button. It's subscribers just like you who help me grow my channel here on YouTube and allow me to continue to make more videos for you guys just like this one. This video also comes with a trigger warning to stop the re-traumatization of victims of similar crimes to the ones described in this video, and it's a warning for violent content, sexual assault against minors, arson, murder and other violent crimes. So if you're sensitive to this type of content, you might want to click away now or watch something else that I have made that isn't quite so heavy. That being said, let's go down the rabbit hole to find out the truth about Australia's worst ever serial killer. And I'm not talking about Ivan Milat, the backpacker killer. I'm talking about the lesser known Vince O'Dempsey, the Bogey Man of Warwick, also known as a magician, as he could make people disappear. A psychopath lacking emotion and empathy. But how did Vince O'Dempsey earn the dubious title of Australia's worst ever serial killer, with a dark 50-year criminal history behind him? To answer this question, we need to travel back in time to when Vince O'Dempsey was just a child, growing up in the small rural town of Warwick in Queensland. In 1955, at the tender age of just 16, Vince's father had him committed to the Toowoomba Mental Hospital, about 85 kilometres north of Warwick. This was where he was diagnosed by Dr. Peter Brown Rowland as a psychopath. His father had him committed as he was causing trouble in and around Warwick. Vince had also left school in Year 9, and he was a patient at the mental hospital for about 5 or 6 months. In 1980, during an inquiry into the disappearances of the McCulkins, Dr. Rowland was asked to give insight into O'Dempsey's mental state at the time that he knew him. Dr. Rowland would answer the court saying it was his conclusion that Vince was a psychopathic personality with schizoid tendencies. And what the doctor meant by this was O'Dempsey was by this time age 16, he was devoid of normal mood changes and human emotions. He was withdrawn and apathetic. The doctor would explain that this is the schizoid personality traits. An apathetic personality has no concept of right or wrong, no capacity for feeling compassion for another person, and is likely to provoke antisocial behaviour with little or no reason. The doctor was also asked, would such a personality as this commit violent, motiveless crimes? To which the doctor would be quoted as answering yes. I may say, people with these personality traits will commit violent crime. Due to overcrowding in the hospital, Vince was soon sent home after 6 months of treatment. In late October 1955, and by this time he had turned 17. He was released into the custody of his parents and returned to the family home in Elizabeth Street, Warwick. Vince was also one of 9 children. Most of his siblings were quite smart and achieving a high standard of education. Although there was a younger brother of Vince who would follow the evil path of his older brother. And as for Vince, he refused to return to school and he went right back to reoffending and antisocial behaviour the minute he got back home to Warwick with his parents. In late 1956, he was charged and convicted of theft, and this would be the beginning of a long and extensive criminal record that would last for over 50 years. But before we delve into that, there is more of Vince's home life to be dug into. During World War II, Tom and Mary Dempsey and their 9 children moved from a family farm just outside Warwick to a house in the heart of town. Tom was a real estate agent and a stock agent with side interests, including growing vegetables for sale, and he would also go on to open up a little takeaway fish and chip shop in Warwick. Mary Dempsey came from one of Warwick's oldest families, and she had her hands pretty full as a stay-at-home mother raising the 9 children. And Vince had 4 brothers and 4 sisters. They lived in an old Queensland-style wooden home in Stewart Avenue, behind a car dealership and within view of St Mary's beautiful Catholic Cathedral. The street Vince lived in was paralleled by a grid of 4 streets: Guy, Palmerin, Wantley and Dragon Street. The street name stemming from an old myth about Guy of Warwick, whom the town of Warwick is named after. Guy was a Palmerin knight who in the story had fallen in love with the Earl of Warwick's daughter, and to prove himself he had travelled abroad, killing dukes, kings, earls, women and children. He also killed monsters, and he also killed a dragon, and the dragon's name was Wantley. The street names had stemmed from this myth, which Vince had become obsessed with. So much so, it is said he has a full torso tattoo of Guy slaying the dragon Wantley. It is thought the Dempseys moved into town when Mary noticed that the then only 4-year-old Vince wasn't like the other Dempsey children. That something was terribly wrong, and yes, he did go on to do terrible things to small animals, and I'm not going to go into that here. And may have had the idea, his mother did, that moving closer to the cathedral and the Catholic Boys' College might have had a good effect on Vince, but she was very wrong. Even at his young age, his teachers and classmates would all agree that Vince stood out as not being like any of the other children attending the schools. He would constantly argue with his teachers. He would not fulfill his homework requirements. He was constantly acting out, and classmates would remember Vince being sent to the principal for a caning. Whereupon Vince would laugh or grin at the teachers like it didn't bother him at all, and the corporal punishment in the Catholic schools back then was pretty harsh. They would actually cane you across your hand, and it was quite painful. His older brother Darcy believed Vince to have a split personality and blamed the disciplinary floggings he received at the school for Vince becoming bad later in life. Coincidentally, this was also around the same time Vince was sent to the mental hospital in Toowoomba. Could his brother Darcy have been correct? Could the regular disciplinary action on an almost daily basis have contributed to Vince's psychosis? So Vince wasn't only getting rapped across the knuckles, he was actually being flogged by the brothers that ran the school. It was also later revealed in an inquest into child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church in the years to follow that the brother who was principal at the time of Vince's daily floggings was charged with sexual assault of a minor decades later. Which begs the question, was there more to Vince's punishments at the hands of this particular brother than met the eye? This is a question that only Vince would answer, but for so far he has never alluded to anything like that happening to him at the school. But what about at home? In a shocking twist in Vince's story, his younger brother Damien, and this is the brother discussed earlier that went evil the same way Vince did, he would actually go on to join the Christian Brothers, and that was the same order that ran Vince's school, and he would also be arrested and charged with the sexual assault of 2 young boys. An old friend of Vince's who knew the family would go on to say several of the townsfolk had their suspicions that their father, Tom Dempsey, may have been sexually abusing his sons. And it would have been easy for him to achieve this and hide it from his wife, as Mary, a devout Catholic, would regularly do a graveyard shift prayer vigil at the cathedral. Vince had a reputation for being extremely tough and would go on to play rugby league and become an amateur boxer. It was by this time, with a built-up physique from boxing and football, Vince was acquiring his taste for violence. With his psychopathic tendencies becoming more prominent by the day, it was also around this time he began displaying antisocial behaviour and was already in trouble with the law. Trespass and threatening language among the charges that were levelled against him even at such a young age. And remember, he's still only about 16, 17 at this point. And it is at this stage that his descent into evil would truly begin to emerge. And the worst part is he was never charged with anything. Everyone was too afraid of Vince to go to the police, so his first truly horrifying crime went unnoticed and he got away with it, unbelievably. One summer night in 1956, not long after he had returned home from the mental hospital, would see Vince sexually assault a younger boy from his community. As the boy and a friend stopped at a corner store for a milkshake, Vince would strike. And the really sick part is the boy knew Vince. Vince's dad and his dad knew each other, so he wasn't actually really afraid of Vince at this point. And unfortunately, the younger boy at the time didn't understand exactly what it was Vince was doing. Considering Vince, and this is icky, so be ready, he had grabbed an ice cream cone and assaulted the lad with that. I think you can imagine what he did. And the witnesses were too afraid of the then 17-year-old Vince to intervene, and the younger boy just took it as a prank. It was never reported to the authorities, and it was where Vince's downward spiral into sadism and depravity would begin. The 2 years after the assault on the younger boy, Vince would be charged with sexually assaulting another child. Vince was convicted this time and was charged the grand total of £25 and given a 6-month good behaviour bond. Now, this definitely would not fly these days. He would have been sentenced to prison, probably for 10 or 15 years, maybe 25, and entered into the sex offender register. In 1958, there were no such elements in place, and to Vince's mind, he had gotten away with it. And he would go on to commit similar crimes and worse again and again. His life as a sexual predator had begun. Vince's history of predation seemed to come with a disturbing pattern of him becoming extremely violent and committing several of these acts in a cluster, and then there would be a cooling off period that would sometimes stretch for months at a time. Could that mean the young boy, and then followed by the younger child that he had assaulted, be Vince's first pattern of this behaviour? What Vince would go on to do just 3 months after this would unfortunately support this theory. In the summer of 1959, Vince would take a teenage girl to a park with other people present, drag her behind a bush and sexually assault her. After which, he would walk off, leave the girl where she was, and he would stand up and give Mark Antony's oration from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar to the shocked onlookers. And if you don't know what the oration from Julius Caesar is, it's Mark Antony's speech that begins with, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." Nobody could do anything to help the young girl or try to stop Vince, for the simple fact they were afraid of him. Other rumours abounded around town that he had murdered a local man and buried his body inside the wall of a dam that was being built just outside Warwick at this time. It's also said he became obsessed with the controversial film The Wild One, starring Marlon Brando. It was a film about antisocial teenage behaviour, and Vince would begin to idolise Marlon Brando and his antisocial characters of the time. Vince was soon prowling the streets of Warwick with a crew of bodgies. That was like another name for gangsters back then. They had a certain way they dressed, which was kind of ridiculous, but nonetheless they were scary. And he had a reputation for theft, violence, and people would go out of their way to avoid Vince and his crew. in the early years of the 1960s would also see Vince go from local thug to drug dealer. He would begin dealing cannabis and would soon transition to dealing heroin. But this is not where Vince would stop. Oh no. He was also trying his hand as a pimp and was running 2 women out of the Mayfair Hotel as prostitutes. Again, he is still only in his teens at this stage. From here, things were about to get worse, a lot worse. On a cold August night in 1959, an off-duty police officer was walking down one of Warwick's central streets when he came across Vince and one of his associates. He had simply asked the 2 men what were they doing and inquired to whether the pair knew anything about a stolen bicycle, to which Vince would offer a curt reply and the officer would go on his way. However, he didn't realise Vince and his friend were following and soon felt a sharp blow to the back of his head. From here, he would fall to the ground with Vince kicking and punching him. He would beg Vince for mercy, but Vince wouldn't stop. And by the time he was picked up by the police with his associate, a man called Desi Locke, Vince had the blood and hair from the officer embedded in his shoes from how severely he had beaten and kicked the man. The officer would go to hospital and he would end up surviving, but he was from that day terrified of Vince and would often cross the street if he saw Vince coming. This time, Vince and his friend would be sentenced to 5 years imprisoned for the assault on the police officer, where he was sent to Bogey Road prison to serve out his sentence with the possibility of parole in 2.5 years, which he did end up getting. After his 2.5 years stay at Bogey Road with terrible conditions and worse food, Vince emerged a wizened, hard-as-nails gangster. His obsession with Marlon Brando and the Bodgies all but forgotten, Vince had reinvented himself. In late 1962, Vince returned home to Warwick. He was broke and now had a criminal record under his belt, but he manages to get himself a job on the construction crew for the Leslie Dam out at Sandy Creek, 11 kilometres away from Warwick. It was here, working on the crew, he met fellow bodgie Raymond Vincent Tommy Allen, aged 22. Vince and Tommy became fast friends, with Tommy introducing Vince to a girl named Margaret, who would later go on to become Vince's first wife. She would also go on to testify against Vince in a court of law years later. Margaret was terrified of Vince in the end. It was also at this time Vince would come under suspicion of robbing a local business in Palmer and Street called Piggott's. He was due to be tried in court for the robbery. However, all the witnesses that had been called to testify against him had miraculously disappeared, and they all failed to attend. The case against Vince faded, and he again had gotten away with yet another crime. And oh yes, by the way, it was Vince who robbed Piggott's. Assisted by an associate who would drive Vince's car far away to remove suspicion from Vince after the robbery. But as you can see, it didn't really work that well, as they knew that it was him that did it and he went to trial anyway. It was after this close call that he moved to Sydney in 1964 with Margaret, and it was here he would establish his links in the Sydney underworld. At this time, he would also become a hitman for the Sydney mob. This was a criminal career that would not last long for Vince, as in 1965, as Margaret was giving birth to their first child, Vince was arrested for possessing an illegal firearm. He was sentenced to 1 year in jail, but would only serve about 6 months. It was shortly after this, Vince struck up a friendship with Brisbane gangster Billy McLaren, who was hanging around Sydney at the same time that Vince was there. And yes, if you put 2 and 2 together, Billy is the father of Leanne and Vicky and the husband of Barbara McLaren. In 1966, back in Brisbane, Vince and Billy would make plans to rob Walton's department store located in Fortitude Valley of their safe. During his stay in Bogey Road, Vince had learned everything there was to know about safe cracking and much more. They managed to rob Walton's of their safe, but somebody turned rat and told a corrupt police officer in Brisbane at the time about Vince and Billy robbing the safe, and Vince was back in jail. Sentenced to 5 years in Bogey Road, with Billy serving just 1 month in remand. And it was this stint in Bogey Road jail that would shape Vince into the monster that he became. It was after his second stint in Bogey Road that Vince would establish relationships that would see him out for the rest of his extensive criminal career, and we're talking almost 50 years at this point. It was here he would meet Shorty Dubois, Tommy Hamilton, Peter Hall and Keith Meredith. These men would go on to form the notorious Clockwork Orange Gang, named after the Stanley Kubrick film that was popular at the time. Vince was released from prison in 1970, and it was after this things would get so much worse with Vince. A lot worse. But before we look further into Vince's crimes leading up to the disappearance of Barbara McCulkin and her 2 daughters, Vicky and Leanne, we need to first look at the relationship between Vince O'Dempsey, Billy McCulkin, and his family. In 1971, Billy had invited Vince to stay with his family in their home with his wife and daughters for at least 6 weeks. I know, right? I can't even process that. It's just, wow. That's all I can say about that. And Vince was almost like a part of the family. So then how is Vince the main person of interest in the disappearance of Barbara, Vicky and Leanne? It will all begin with Vince shifting into the life of an underworld gangster heavyweight and the plan to firebomb a nightclub in the heart of Brisbane, the Whooshka or Go-Go. Deeply entrenched with corrupt police officers and other underworld figures, Vince was protected species and was literally getting away with murder. At 6 a.m. in the last days of 1970, Vince was released from Bogey Road and the bogeyman of Warwick was once again on the loose. From here, he would go directly to 6 Dorchester Street to the home of his old friend Billy McCulkin. In fact, Billy would go on to invite several of his criminal associates to his home at this time. I can only imagine what Barbara and the girls had to listen to and endure with their husband and father bringing these men home. So this included John Andrew Stewart, who was convicted of a stabbing when he was just a teenager, Billy Phillips, a tattoo artist and stolen goods fence, suffering succotash, sorry guys, stolen goods fence, who was said to allow women to pay for a tattoo from him with sex. What a lovely man. And of course the crew from Bogey Road, the Clockwork Orange Gang. These were the men mentioned earlier, but one would stand out far more than the others, and that was Vincent's best little friend, Gary Shorty Dubois. A short man with long hair and a conviction of sexual assault. He had a proclivity for underage girls and was obsessed with cult killer Charles Manson. And Billy allowed all of these men into the house with his wife and his 2 young daughters. Subsequently, plans for upcoming crimes were discussed in the house where Barbara and the girls were often present. This would include the discussion about the plan to firebomb the Whooshka or Go-Go. So you have to kind of wonder how much had Barbara and the girls heard. Could this have been the reason they disappeared? And was Vince and another of Billy's cronies responsible? Prior to the bombing of the Whooshka or Go-Go, they had been involved with another arson. They had been paid to do this as a job for an insurance fraud, and the gang was also involved in numerous smash and grab raids and other types of theft. And a lot of this was being run by the corrupt police that were present at the time, and this was often how Vince and his buddies would get paid for these jobs that they would do. This also afforded Vince and his gang protection from the law, and for Vince, as the leader of the group, it also afforded him a very handsome paycheck. It was in 1971 that Vince came into enough money to buy himself a flashy new car, a bright orange Valiant Charger. The same model of car that Vicky and Leanne McCulkin would notice parked in the driveway of their family home the night they returned from the birthday party across the street. They would have just thought, oh, Uncle Vince is here, probably just for a visit, probably came to see Mum to see how we're doing. They would have thought nothing of it. And from there, they were never seen alive again. Meanwhile, around the same time, Vince would buy a block of land in Warwick, down a very aptly named haunted and spooky road, Ghost Gate Road, where it's rumoured Vince had his own personal private graveyard. At this time, Vince was also known as the king of the brothels in Brisbane and was receiving kickbacks from the corrupt police officers that he was working for. He was cashed up, protected, and greatly feared. This made Vince O'Dempsey a dangerous man indeed. A diagnosed psychopath with no respect for the law and no concept of right and wrong, and a passion for sexual assault and murder. It's not an exaggeration to say that pretty much everybody who was in this area at this time was afraid of the Warwick bogeyman. This would include the women who worked for him in his brothels. By 1972, he had left his wife Margaret and his daughter and was now living with a woman named Diane Pritchard, who was a madam who worked in one of his brothels. It was also around this time he was asked to organise an insurance fraud arson job, and this was the one I sort of touched lightly on before at Torino's, another restaurant and nightclub in Fortitude Valley, owned by the Ponticelli brothers. Vince jumped at this chance and he planned the firebombing with Billy McCulkin. The Clockwork Orange boys were commissioned to do the dirty work, and the crime remained unsolved for almost 45 years. That was until one of the Clockwork Orange boys that was there that February night in 1973 confessed to the crime and also spoke of Vince and Billy's involvement. So, back in Dorchester Street at this time, Barbara McCulkin also knew of the plan to bomb Torino's. She knew her husband Billy and his best mate Vince had blown up the restaurant, and they had planned it all under her nose in the family home. However, nobody was harmed in this blast, fortunately. It was just an insurance scam job, and Billy had picked up his share in cash, and it was the next firebombing that Barbara would overhear them planning that would ultimately cost her and her 2 daughters and 15 other people their lives. It was the plan to blow up the Whiskey or Go-Go nightclub. Situated in Fortitude Valley, it was a seedy late-night dive run by criminals and hitmen and corrupt officials. Barbara couldn't have known at the time that just 11 days after the fire at Torino's, someone would firebomb the Whiskey and lay claim to, at that time, Australia's worst mass murder. And this was way before Port Arthur, and I will be covering Port Arthur in another video soon. 15 people were killed in the Whiskey that night. March 8th, 1973, At 2:08 in the morning, fire raced up the staircase of the Whooshka and consumed its victims. The big question to ask here, of course, was where was Vince Dempsey when the Whooshka or Go-Go erupted in flames? In the club that night was a group of young women on a hen's night, 2 young police constables, a canteen worker from the local railway station, and a telephone operator. The Whooshka was thought of as a last chance saloon, rumoured to be running prostitutes and owned by the criminal underworld. It was seedy and lacked the class of similar establishments in the areas like Checkers. However, it still attracted popular music artists, and also present on the night that the Whooshka blew was the popular bebop band from the 1950s, the Deltones. So what does all this have to do with Vince Dempsey, who claimed, well, he was in Sydney at the time, but if you remember back to his earlier days, he had friends pose as him before and make it look like he was away from the areas that he had committed other crimes in. However, there was plenty of evidence showing that Vince Dempsey was indeed in Brisbane at the time of the Whooshka bombing. One criminal told police witnesses had seen Vince skulking around outside the club just before the fire. Notorious police detective Roger Rogerson had been flown up from Sydney to investigate the Whooshka and told a journalist decades later that a man named Vince had thrown a Molotov cocktail into the club that night. It is thought that gangsters from the Sydney underworld ordered the firebombing and Vince and Billy had organised and executed it. About 50 people were present in the club that night, with most of them coming to see the Deltones. And the Deltones had ended up narrowly missing being inside the club when the fire happened. It turns out they had left just a few moments before, and they'd actually had to go back and get one of their band members who had decided to stay for a little bit, but one of the guys was like, oh, should we go check on him? I think we should just all leave together. So they went back, they picked up their friend, and they left. There was also a woman in a phone booth across the road from the Whooshka who would witness 3 men in a long black American-style sedan cruise up to the entrance of the Whooshka, and 3 men in black would get out, 2 of which she would describe as being of average height and 1 who was tall and thin. The men then got a fuel drum out of the back seat of the car and were seen pushing a rag into the top of the drum to make like a wick. They then rolled the drum into the foyer of the Whooshka, a match was lit, the witness ran, and the next thing she knew, the Whooshka had erupted in flames. Later that night, 15 bodies would be lined up on the pavement outside. All had died of carbon monoxide poisoning before the flames could ever get to them. 15 people already deceased. Later the same morning as the Whooshka fire over in Dorchester Street, Barbara McCulkin had taken a short stroll down to the store to buy a newspaper. And Barbara would do this every morning. She would make a cup of tea, she'd head down, she would grab her paper, she'd come back, she'd drink her tea and she would read. The headlines glared out about the atrocity at the Whooshka the night before, and Barbara McCulkin was heard to utter in a shocked whisper by several people who were also in the store, "Oh my God, they actually did it." Did Barbara mean her husband and Vince? And did it get back to Vince that Barbara may have known way too much? It came to light later that arson on the Whooshka was another insurance scam. And Vince had, of course, masterminded the similar insurance scam with the similar firebombing of Torino's 11 days before. As for Barbara McCulkin, she was absolutely terrified. She fled her home in Dorchester Street at this time and sent her daughters to stay with separate friends. She didn't even keep the family all together. She was so afraid of Vince. A workmate of Barbara's would go on to tell the police after she disappeared that after the burning of the Whooshka Club in the Valley, Barbara had phoned her and asked could she stay with her for the night. She had arrived at her friend's home driven by Billy and another unnamed individual. I'm guessing it probably wasn't Vince, because Barbara wouldn't have wanted Vince to know where she was going. And upon her arrival, she would tell her friend she didn't want to stay at her own home. She was very upset. She said that the police may have bugged her house, and she was very afraid for what might have come out of that. And it was shortly after this, the police rounded up criminals in the area. Billy McCulkin would be among them. He would be questioned for hours and later released without charge due to insufficient evidence. And where was Vince? So we need to remember he had tried to make it look like he was in Sydney and that he just heard about the whole thing on the radio and on the news. But a police source that was very trusted would go on to tell journalist Matt Condon, who was looking extensively into this case, he's also the author of the Ghost Gate Road podcast, that Vince was in fact in Brisbane and was caught up in the same sweep as Billy McCulkin. But again, he slipped the net and was released without charge, also due to insufficient evidence. What came next was two men named Stewart and Finch that were part of the Clockwork Orange gang were arrested and charged with the Whiskey Fire bombing. However, witnesses would continue to say Vince O'Dempsey had been seen lurking outside the Whiskey on the night of the fire. Over at Dorchester Street, the clock was ticking for Barbara McCulkin and her daughters. By the end of 1973, Finch and Stewart, associates of Vince O'Dempsey, had been tried and convicted of the arson attack at the Whiskey. Charged each with 15 counts of murder and arson, they were sent back to Bogey Road for good. The witnesses had been silenced, and things were settling down a little bit for Vince at this stage, except for the one loose end. And that one loose end was Barbara McCulkin. It was around this time her marriage to Billy was beginning to break down. She knew he was involved in the firebombing of Torino's 11 days before the Whiskey. She also knew that he was involved in the Whiskey bombing. That, along with his ties to the criminal underworld, his drinking. He was also cheating on Barbara with various women. He would also beat Barbara, and she had a horrid suspicion that perhaps Billy may have even been molesting his daughters. And this all just became way too much for Barbara, and the couple would end up separating. Barbara and the girls would remain in Dorchester Street, while Billy moved away to another part of town and moved in with another woman. Barbara at this time was also ready to go to the police and tell them her husband was involved with known criminals and had had something to do with the Whiskey a Go-Go firebombing. However, if Barbara gave up Billy to the authorities, she would also be giving up others that were involved. And that would include Vince O'Dempsey. And as we know, whenever Vince felt his freedom was threatened, he would eliminate that threat. Remember, they used to call him the magician because he made people disappear. And Barbara McCulkin was at this time a major threat to Vince, especially since it seemed Vince's luck was changing for the better at this time. He had opened a massage parlour which doubled as a brothel in Lutwich Street. His girlfriend, Diane Pritchard, the brothel manager, or madam. There were also suspicions that he was paid by corrupt police officers for his part in the Whiskey a Go-Go fire, and this allowed him to purchase the massage parlour. By November 1973, Barbara had kicked Billy out and their marriage was over officially. And this would become the most dangerous period of time for Barbara. because this would go on to leave Barbara alone with her daughters, and she had to return to the house in Dorchester Street. She couldn't stay with her friend forever. She had very little money, and at this time Brisbane was also about to descend into the worst flooding that the city had seen for over a century, very similar to the flooding that we experienced here in Australia last Christmas. It was as Barbara tried to keep things as normal as possible for her girls in January 1974. She was paid the visit by her husband's friend, Vince, and his little mate, Shorty Dubois. What came next for Barbara and her two innocent daughters was nothing short of horrific. On the 16th of January 1974, as Vicky and Leanne attended a birthday party across the road at the Gayton house, and the rain beat ceaselessly on the tin roof, Barbara would sit quietly sewing her daughters' uniforms for the coming school year. A knock came on the door. Barbara put down her sewing and went to see who was there. So somewhere around 8:30 to 10:30 p.m. that night, the girls would leave the party and return home to find Vince's bright orange Valiant Charger in the driveway. From here, Vince would offer to take Barbara and the girls for a little spin around town with himself and Shorty in his flashy, very distinctive car. So Barbara would leave the lights on. She would lock the door. She would put the two pet cats in the laundry and leave with her daughters. It was also found later that she probably left with her slippers still on, and she had left her purse and other belongings on the kitchen table. She never took them with her. It was after this the McCulkin girls would be driven to Vince's private graveyard on Ghostgate Road in Warwick, where he and Shorty Dubois would march the women, bound and gagged, into the forest, sexually assault and murder all three of them. It was almost 45 years before Vince O'Dempsey would be convicted and charged with their murders, while he has never revealed the location of their bodies. However, these were not the only murders that Vince O'Dempsey was thought to be responsible for. It was known he had an obsession for picking up hitchhikers, and he is suspected of being responsible for several disappearances in the Warwick area and in New South Wales during the 70s and 80s, and it is thought that a lot of crimes that may have been actually blamed on Ivan Milat at that time could have been perpetrated by Vince O'Dempsey. While O'Dempsey would later admit to being responsible for at least 33 murders, and that sounds like a lot, locals from Warwick and the Brisbane area and criminal associates would put the number closer to over 100 people. Vince was also found to have threatened the lives of the Gayton sisters across the road, whose birthday party Vicky and Leanne had been attending the night they went missing. Vince knew the girls had seen him and Shorty at the McCulkin house. He had tried unsuccessfully to put a hit out on the Gayton sisters. They would go on to attend Vince's trial in 2017. The then 78-year-old Vince was convicted at his trial in 2017 of all 3 killings after a 4-week trial in Brisbane Supreme Court. A little over a day after the jury hearing the case retired to consider the verdict. Vince was not on his own in being brought to justice for the death of the McCulkins. His accomplice, Gary Shorty Dubois, now 70 at the time of his trial, was also found guilty of sexually assaulting and murdering the sisters, as well as Barbara McCulkin's manslaughter. Both Vince and Shorty's downfalls came from their confessions to people they thought that they could trust. O'Dempsey, an underworld figure known as the Angel of Death, first opened up to associate Warren McDonald when they were working together on Vince's cannabis farm in Carrara, And that's in Queensland, and it's not too far from his property in Warwick and the Ghostgate Road. MacDonald told the trial they were driving to Warwick in 1997 when Vince O'Dempsey boasted that he had killed the McCulkins but would never be charged for the crime. In 2011, Kerry Scully was engaged to O'Dempsey when he told her to buy the true crime book Shotgun and Standover from the local Big W. While in bed, Dempsey would show her a picture in the book of himself walking from court with a leather jacket slung over his shoulder, and then he would brag to her about the McCulkin murders. "I'm good for it, but they'll never get me for it," O'Dempsey had said. Scully had then left the relationship the next day and remained in fear of the man who she later told police was an intelligent serial killer who was very, very good at covering his tracks. She would also go on to say that he takes you in the middle of the night, like the angel of death, and then you're gone for good. Scully told this to a committal hearing in November 2015. Final key witness emerged just months before O'Dempsey's trial, a remand prisoner who cannot be identified, and he had noted down a confession on scrap pieces of paper and crosswords of what Vince had gone on to tell him. "She had to be dealt with," O'Dempsey said. "In those days you got paid to do a job, you did a job. I never laid a hand on the kids. Shorty did." The informant also said O'Dempsey solicited him once he was granted bail to contact a person who would stop Scully, a woman that was engaged to Vince, and MacDonald from giving evidence at the trial. He was trying to arrange to get at him, the informant said, and I think we all know what that means. Vince used to be a hitman, and he was now trying to solicit a hit on his ex-fiancée and MacDonald so they would not be able to testify against him in the trial. The witness would also go on to say that Vince knew what time MacDonald left for work, which road he took, which roadhouse he stopped at for breakfast, and the number of his house. This evidence was enough for the jury. On the 25th of November 2016, Dubois, then aged 69, was found guilty of the murders. On May 26, 2017, O'Dempsey, then aged 78, was also found guilty of murder. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment on the 1st of June 2017. 2 weeks before Gary Dubois was due along with Vince O'Dempsey and several others to give evidence in an inquiry into the 1973 Whiskey A Go-Go firebombing, was found dead in his prison cell at 4:30 a.m. June 7, 2021. It is still unclear to his cause of death. Vince O'Dempsey is now 83 years old and still alive and serving out his remaining years in Brisbane jail. He is also found guilty of the 1964 murder of police informant Vincent Allen. He is also suspected of more murders, and none of which he has ever confessed to. Many more. He is also suspected in the disappearance of 37-year-old mother Tanya Buckland in 2014. It is believed O'Dempsey had entered into a sexual relationship with Miss Buckland, and several items belonging to Miss Buckland were found in Vincent O'Dempsey's home in Warwick. Again, Vince has not commented on why Miss Buckland's possessions were found in his home, or ever having a relationship with her, or ever even having known Tanya Buckland. Excavations on what was thought to be Vince's private graveyard out on Ghostgate Road have found fragments believed to be human bones, but so far testing has remained inconclusive. And finally, we come to the end of this most horrific and twisted story in Australia's history. Vince O'Dempsey is thought to be responsible for the deaths of over 100 people, and most of which we will never know the names of. But the time has come to pay respect to the victims whose names we do know. Barbara McCulkin, 34. Vicky McCulkin, 13. Leanne McCulkin, 11. Vincent Allen, police informant, age unknown. The Whiskey A Go-Go fire victims. Desmay Selma Carroll. Darcy Thomas Day. Jennifer Denise Davey. Wendy Leanne Drew. Colin William Folster. Carol Ann Green. Petrius Franciscus Peter Marcus. William David Nolan. Leslie Gordon Palethorpe. Desmond John Peters. Ernest John Peters. Brian William Watson. David John Westron. Faye Ellen Will. Paul Ferdinand Zoller. If this episode has raised any issues for you, I'll be providing numbers at the end of the video that you can use to seek support. And I'd also like to give recognition to the award-winning journalist Matthew Condon, author of the Ghost Gate Road podcast that I listened to in order to help with my research for this case. If you would like to delve deeper into the twisted world of Vince O'Dempsey, I will be leaving links to the Ghost Gate Road podcast by Matt and his amazing team at Whooshka Studios so that you can listen along if you want to go further into this case. And the case was a long commitment of Matt's as his life as a journalist and his dogged determination to find justice for the McCulkin family that did eventually help to crack the case that the police were trying to solve for almost 40 to 50 years, and at great personal danger to himself, as Vince O'Dempsey was well aware that Matt was digging into the case and Vince wasn't happy about it at all. So please go and check out Matt's podcast. He and his team have put an enormous amount of work into it, and as I just said, this was a lifelong project, case, whatever you want to call it, for Matt, and it's no wonder that he is one of our most award-winning journalists. So you may even like to look up other things that Matt has written. He's a terrific writer, so please go and visit his podcast, and you can also go to ghostgateroad.com if you would like more information, and if you just couldn't get enough of Ghost Gate Road, you can go to their discussion group on Facebook, and I will provide links for all of these things in the description box below for Matt. And lastly, thank you all again so much for watching. Please go and watch something fun or happy after this because, yeah, that was a lot and I will be doing the same. Join me again next week for another Australian real crime case. Until then, stay safe, stay happy, and much love. See you all soon.